Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, April 12th, 2022, and in about 2.5 years, we will hit the 2024 November presidential election. Now, this is an exciting election because it will be a determining point as to whether or not President Biden should continue into a second term or whether a Republican, potentially Donald Trump, ends up back or into the White House for the next 4 years. Now, it seems like a long way away, but back in 2018, I was making a bunch of videos talking about the 2020 presidential election, and a lot of the data from back then ended up being pretty relevant for the 2020 campaign season. A lot of the polls and a lot of the early estimates ended up being pretty accurate later on, and they sort of indicated to us what was actually going to be competitive, both nationwide and in terms of individual races. Now, the recency of all of these polls actually comes from a time span of about a few weeks. What you're looking at here is you have polls from March 18th to March 21st to April 3rd that end on April 4th. You have polls that have been done up across the nation from Harris, Redfield Milton Strategies, YouGov, Marquette University Law School, McConnell and Associates, and of course my favorite, the Harvard University poll. You know, what you're finding is that you're looking at a number of reputable polling sources pretty much gauge our national sort of sentiment towards Biden and towards President Trump. And what you're finding is that you're seeing a lot of conflicting data. You're seeing a lot of data that's telling you Biden is up on one hand, whereas Trump is up on the other. And sometimes it's a very similar poll or even within the same poll that shows another Democrat defeating Trump, but potentially Biden losing, which might draw some very big questions and a lot of eyes towards that individual circumstance. But, you know, overall, what we're finding is that the numbers here seem to be much worse for Biden than they were back in the 2018 timeframe when Biden was being polled against Donald Trump back in the 2020 campaign season. What you found was that Biden almost routinely defeated President Trump because President Trump was just so unpopular. Now what we're finding is that Biden and Trump are roughly at the same level of disapproval. Donald Trump being disapproved of by 11 points nationwide, Joe Biden being disapproved of by 10 points nationwide. I mean, the difference here isn't super dramatic, and it is a very telling sign that Joe Biden has now become, in essence, the Democratic Party's, at least Donald Trump, when it comes down to favorability rating. I will say that popularity rating in terms of a candidate as someone like Donald Trump who's outside of office, who no longer has any type of technical responsibilities, where you have Joe Biden in office, where an approval rating poll is probably going to be a little bit less dramatic in terms of the way that people view a politician, which means that generally speaking, you should view the approval rating poll being down negative as a little bit better if it's equal footing to someone who is favored or unfavored by a similar amount. But again, that's discussion for another video, and I honestly don't know if that holds up true in our modern era. One thing that I do want to say, though, is that beyond the Joe Biden and Donald Trump approval rating, the American public right now prefers the Republican Party. That's why Republicans have maintained a lead for 3 months now on the generic ballot. More Americans want Republicans to be in power than they do want Democrats, and that's just the standard understanding that we have from these generic ballot polls. Now, I will say that there are a surprisingly large amount of undecided voters back in 2018 or 2014 or 2010. At this point in time, we didn't have around, a sixth of the nation that didn't know how to vote. Generally speaking, we found people that were maybe, at most 10% undecided, 12%. But to see us in a position right now where you're looking at over 15% of the electorate as, or nearly 15% of the electorate as undecided, it is quite shocking to say the least. At a low point for both of these parties, they were hovering around 42%, which meant about 18% of the nation simply did not have a preference as of right now as to who they wanted in office. Now, again, I do want to say as well that these polls underestimate the Republican Party. They tend to oversample Democrats and seem to reliably overpredict the Democratic Party's chances of victory. So I will say that the Republicans are probably up somewhere around 3 to 4 to 5 points nationwide. But regardless, my takeaway from here is that despite Biden and Trump being at a similar level in terms of approval, the Republican Party is the party that is taking away from this and gaining. And you see that a lot with the Trump and Biden polls. Now, I think it would be good for context to look back at older polls from 2018 because it is very interesting to see. Let's see if we can find some of the earlier on races nationwide polling for the 2020 presidential election. Let's go ahead and see before 2017 and 2018. Let's see if we can actually open it up. Press it open, and there we have so many of these polls. But what you can see is that this blue lead for Joe Biden over Donald Trump practically was every single poll. I mean, what you found was that if we were looking at this from the lens of 2020's presidential election is what 2024 is to us right now, we're somewhere around this range between May and March of 2018, where Joe Biden was defeating President Trump by 17 points, by 10 points. I mean, when you take a look at these leads, what do you find? 14, 14, 14, 14, 15, 12, 13, 9, 9, 16, 11, 14, 15, 17. A lot of overload. Well, the point being that it's a lot of overload for a reason. It's showing you that Biden is winning by dramatic and exponential proportions compared to what he actually won by. And I think it is a telling sign that back then we knew Biden was going to win the election. If I was to put money on it back then, I would have said definitively Biden was going to win the election. And I did say it multiple times. I think there wasn't a single video where I had Biden faced up against Trump where Biden lost the election. I think it was very obvious from the very beginning who was going to be the Democratic nominee and who was going to win that election. Now that I'm looking at the data, and I'm looking at it actually at this point, I'm even more surprised because I didn't look at this data before the video even started recording, because I just remembered it from the multiple videos I made about the 2020 presidential election during this time period. But what you're finding is that Biden was demolishing Trump. Well, the numbers now show that in some cases, Trump is demolishing Biden. And this is where it gets tricky, because that's not the general consensus. The consensus here is that Donald Trump is ahead. The consensus is that Republicans are ahead, yes. But you're not looking at 17, 10, 12-point victories. What you're looking at here is some polls showing Biden up by 5. Some polls showing Trump up by 5. You have Redfield and Wilson's strategies that shows Trump over Biden by 5 points amongst likely voters nationwide. YouGov, Biden plus 5 nationwide. Harvard-Harris, Trump up by 6 points nationwide. Marquette University Law School, Biden up 4 points nationwide. McClellan and Associates, Trump up 3 points nationwide. Echelon Insights shows Biden up 2 points nationwide. UMass Lowell shows Biden up 2 points. And Hofstra University shows about an even margin. So what do I take from this? Honestly, as someone who looks at this from an analytical lens, I am quite perplexed by the very large difference in these polls, because that's not what we saw in previous elections. Even when we looked at, let's say, 2013, when Hillary Clinton was faced up against Rand Paul, against Chris Christie, against Jeb Bush for the 2016 race, because Donald Trump wasn't really a big name until his big announcement, Hillary Clinton was defeating them all. And I think honestly and truly, the only Republican who could have defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election was Donald Trump. I mean, she started out as this very large frontrunner, and that never really changed. I think that's, very, very clear. But, looking at the numbers then, they indicated that Hillary Clinton was going to win the popular vote, and she did. Looking at the numbers from 2005, potential contenders like Hillary Clinton were still leading the Republicans when it came down to opinion polling. So what we found then, and on a very consistent basis, is that there was a general consensus to all of the early polls, and they weren't typically too far off from reality. While obviously Biden didn't win by 16 points, I don't think it was right for anyone to ever assume that Biden could have won by 16 points. I do want to say that the numbers were accurate in terms of predicting who won, but the margin was arguably way off. But this also sort of showed exactly how much Biden had in terms of an advantage going into 2020 and how much Donald Trump actually brought back in terms of broad support. So keeping that all in mind, I think that it is important to look at these polls and say, we are now in a tricky position because we are looking at potentially a rematch of the 2020 presidential election, yet we are seeing no similarities. And the reason why we don't see similarities is because Biden is president of the United States. But I would say the good news for Biden is that some polls show him holding on. I think if I was in the Trump administration back during the 2017-2018 timeframe, and I was looking at polls showing me that the Democrats were defeating me, or my administration, or, my President Trump by 16 points, by 11 points, I would be quite alarmed because there isn't a single poll that you can see there that shows Donald Trump ahead. I think the first poll that showed Trump defeating Biden was September 2019, when Rasmussen reports, of course it was Rasmussen reports, when Rasmussen reports showed Trump ahead by 4 points. The next one was Zogby Analytics. The next one after that was Emerson College, and then it was Zogby Analytics again. And then, beyond that, what do you have? About 100 polls here that show Joe Biden defeating Donald Trump with about 5 exceptions in terms of a lead for Joe Biden. 4 Trump wins and 1 tie, and about, 80 Biden victories. So again, keep that all in mind when you look at these numbers. When you see that what we are finding now about a back and forth really doesn't make sense. But I do want to say that, again, polls do underestimate Republican support. I think these early numbers are a perfect indicator of such overestimations. To put it in a position where, people were comfortable releasing numbers that showed Biden up 17 points nationwide, I mean, that's laughable, right? It's, not at all a reality that Biden ever could have won the national popular vote by 17 points. That hasn't been done in American history as of recently. Not even Reagan won the national popular vote by 17 percentage points. So what you find here is that the numbers sort of don't add up. The numbers here show the Republican Party being underestimated. And that's it. That's why I would say there is probably more numbers telling us that Trump is in the lead. More numbers telling us that the Republican Party is ahead. Also, I do want to correct myself there. I believe Ronald Reagan in 1984 won by about 17 points, so was a bit off on that statement, but I guess it takes a Reagan type of victory of 49 states losing one by just, a few thousand votes to reach 17%. So it was never really a reality to show, Biden up 17 points over Donald Trump. I think it was more so that these individual voters were upset with President Trump. But at the end of the day, we're going to end up voting for him. But I think right now you are starting to see an exact opposite circumstance for the Democratic Party where President Biden is unpopular, so voters are turning away from him. But I also do want to say that it is harder to gauge Trump support when he is the person on the ballot. It is harder to gauge the amount of support that a Republican like Donald Trump will get when it is his name, because he is a polarizing person. This is the Trump effect that, leading into the 2020 election, I didn't think was real. Part of me was saying, yes, there is obviously discrepancies, but I thought, polling had 4 years to correct itself. They had 4 years to do an internal analysis to see what exactly they missed, and yet they were finding similar things to the 2020 election. Now, I have admitted time and time again fault for underestimating the Trump support. I thought, looking at the amount of rallies and the amount of yard signs and the amount of people that are just so openly endorsing and in support of President Trump following his election victory, I mean, you see it with Republicans in Congress, that the Trump effect dissipated, that there wasn't that hidden silent majority vote. And yet it was very evident after the 2020 election that there was. So if Trump is up by 5 points in a poll against Biden, I would argue that he's probably up by more. I don't think that these Republican groups or even nonpartisan groups benefit at all by saying that Trump is, leading Biden. Nobody benefits by lying about polling numbers unless you're talking about maybe an appeasement poll for a candidate or trying to shape the narrative against a particular candidate. But even then, it becomes tricky. I do not believe that these polls are lying to us about the numbers. What I think that tells us about 2024 is that Republicans are ahead. When you take a look at what they need in order to win, it doesn't actually seem too far off because they almost won the 2020 presidential election. What I'm doing right now is characterizing all of the states that went to the Republican Party in the 2020 election. Every single one of them. Every single district. Every single state. Because it matters. It matters a lot because these are the baseline states for the GOP. You have about 235 electoral votes that Republicans right now will win easily. Biden isn't making any inroads when he's less popular than he was in the 2020 election. Beyond that, think about the states that were the closest. Look back at the 2020 election. What states were decided by less than 1 point? Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona. So what happens if those states flip? Is it enough? We'll see. Arizona brings you to 246. Wisconsin brings you to 256. And guess what puts you over the top? The state of Georgia. Had, every single state voted by just 1 percentage point to the right of how it did in the 2020 election, Donald Trump would have been reelected. Now, you can make the case in 2016. Had every single state voted to the left by 1 point more than it did in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have won, and that would have been true. Pennsylvania would have gone blue, Michigan would have gone blue, Wisconsin would have gone blue. But again, an argument for another day, and not really an argument that matters as much now for 2016 because the Democrats are in the White House. Beyond this, if you're looking at truly a Trump victory of 6-7 points nationwide, forget about those other states. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania are going to vote together again. Throw in Minnesota, throw in Nevada, right? Throw in New Hampshire, throw in Maine for, crying out loud. Throw in potentially Virginia or Colorado or New Mexico. These states come into play when you swing the popular vote by 12 percentage points. But I think it isn't too far to see how you could see a swing of 12 percentage points when the nation is against Biden by 10 when they approved of him by 7 going into office. The nation has already swung on terms of its approval of Biden by what you're talking about here, 10 and 7, 17 points. And in terms of the generic ballot, well, we started off at a better point here looking at the numbers, seeing that the Democratic Party was in a better position than they are right now. You're talking about a pretty significant shift nationwide, especially relative to the last generic ballot. You're talking about nearly 10 points. So a 12-point shift actually isn't too far out of the extremes. So these polls are telling us conflicting data, but I think one thing is evident. Trump is doing significantly better now than he was back then. And I think that tells us a lot about what we should expect for 2024. That is something that we definitely need to talk about further in depth, about Trump's electability and Trump's chances. But based off of these polls, if I was in Mar-a-Lago with President Trump, I would tell you, you are in a comfortable position. All you have to do is wait for Biden to make himself more unpopular. And that's just the waiting game in American politics. Democrats allowed Trump to destroy his own re-election bid. Obviously, they helped. Obviously, they contributed in taking him down. He was the opposing president. But I will say that the Republican Party is employing the same strategy as has been employed for centuries in American politics, and I think it's becoming much more evident as we take a look at a lot of this data that's coming across our screen week after week from multiple polling firms across the nation. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.